Let me ask you something, and I want you to think about this honestly before you answer. When someone asks you a question in English, something simple, something you actually know the answer to, why do you feel that pause? That moment where your brain kind of stalls? Where you know exactly what you want to say, but the words won't come out, at least not in English? You stand there, and you are translating. Word by word. Phrase by phrase. You are building the sentence in your native language first, and then you are converting it, piece by piece, into English. And by the time you're halfway through that process, either the moment has passed, or you have lost confidence, or the sentence that finally comes out sounds nothing like what you actually meant to say. Here is the question I want you to sit with for this entire video, and I want you to write your answer in the comments section below once you have finished watching. If translation is the problem, what exactly is the alternative? And more importantly, can your brain actually learn to stop translating after years, maybe decades, of doing it? Write your answer below. Tell me what you think the answer is before you finish the video, and then come back and tell me if this video changed what you believe. Before we go any further, if you are someone who studies English seriously, if you are someone who wants to actually speak this language without the fear, without the hesitation, without the mental exhaustion of translating every single thought, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the bell. Because everything we do here is built specifically for people like you who are serious about the speaking reset. Not tricks. Not shortcuts. Real rewiring. Real results. Now, let's get into it. What you are about to hear over the next 2 hours is not a standard English lesson. There are no grammar drills in this video. There are no vocabulary lists. There is no textbook language. What this video is a complete, honest, deep-level explanation of what is actually happening inside your brain when you speak English, why the translation habit forms, why it is so hard to break, and most importantly, exactly what you have to do, day by day and moment by moment, to rewire the system from the inside out. This is not a quick fix. But if you give this video your full attention, if you actually listen and sit with what is being said here, you will walk away understanding your English problem in a way that you never have before. And that understanding alone will change everything. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Translation Trap, What is actually happening in your brain. Most English learners believe that their problem is vocabulary. They think, if I just knew more words, I could speak faster. Or they believe it is grammar. They think, if I could just get the tenses right, I would sound fluent. And so they study more vocabulary. They review more grammar rules. They download more apps. They buy more books. And still, when they open their mouth to speak in a real conversation, the same thing happens. The pause. The hesitation. The translation. The real problem is not vocabulary. The real problem is not grammar. The real problem is a deeply wired mental process called first language mediation, and until you understand what it is, you will keep studying the wrong things. Here is what first language mediation means in plain terms. When a native English speaker has a thought, let's say the thought is that they are hungry and they want to suggest getting food, their brain does not produce a sentence in some language-neutral space and then dress it up in English words. Their brain thinks the thought directly in English. The words, the structure, the rhythm, all of it emerges together as a single unit. There is no translation stage. The thought and the language are fused. Now here is what happens in your brain when you are a non-native speaker who learned English the traditional way, through textbooks, through school, through grammar study. When you have the same thought, I'm hungry, let's get food, your brain generates that thought in your native language first. Not because your native language is better. Not because you are less intelligent, but because your native language has years and years of deep neural pathways built into it. It is the language of your childhood, the language of your emotions, the language of your dreams. It is hardwired. So the thought forms in your native language. Then, and this is the critical step, your brain kicks over to a translation process. It takes that native language thought and converts it into English. It searches for the English word that matches this native language word. It finds the grammar pattern that fits this kind of sentence. It checks the result. It decides if it sounds right. And then, only after all of that, it sends the signal to your mouth. And that process every single time takes time. Mental energy. Conscious attention. Which is why speaking English feels exhausting. Which is why, in fast conversations, you fall behind. Which is why when someone asks you something unexpected, your mind goes blank. Not because you don't know English, but because the translation machine is under too much pressure. Here is something that makes this even more complicated. Translation does not just slow you down. Translation actually distorts what you say. Because languages do not map onto each other perfectly. Every language has its own way of framing reality, its own idioms, its own rhythms, its own logic. When you translate from your native language into English, you are not just swapping words. You are trying to force one system of thought into another system that was built differently. And the result is speech that is technically correct, maybe, but sounds strange. Stiff. Unnatural. Textbook-like. Not like the way a real person actually speaks. This is why so many intermediate and advanced learners, people who score high on grammar tests, people who have studied English for 10 or 15 years, still sound robotic when they speak. Still hesitate. Still feel like outsiders in the language. Because they have never broken the translation habit. They have only gotten faster at translating. But faster translation is not fluency. Fluency is no translation at all. Now, the important question is, why does this habit form in the first place? The answer is almost entirely about how English was taught to you. Think about how most people learn English in school. The teacher writes a word on the board in English. Underneath it, they write the translation in your native language. You memorize the pair. Dog. Your word for dog. Cat. Your word for cat. The first lesson you are ever taught about English is that English words are substitutes for your own words. That English is a code, and your native language is the key. Then you move to grammar. And how do teachers explain English grammar? By comparing it to your native language grammar. They say things like, in English, the verb comes here, but in our language, the verb comes there. The adjective in English goes before the noun, but in our language it goes after. Every explanation of English is framed in terms of your native language. Every rule is understood through comparison. So from the very first day of English class, your brain is trained to treat English as a translation of your native language, not as its own independent system. And that training runs deep. After years of that approach, the habit is automatic. It is the default. It is the only way your brain knows how to access English. And here is the cruel irony of that system. The better you get at grammar study, the better you get at translation, which means the deeper the translation habit goes. A student who has studied English grammar for 8 years is not 8 years ahead of a student who has studied for 1 year in terms of real fluency. In many cases, they are actually more stuck. Because the translation pathways are more reinforced, more automatic, more ingrained. This is what we call the translation trap. You did not fall into it because you are a bad learner. You fell into it because the system that taught you English was built on translation from day one. And breaking out of it is not about studying more. It is about fundamentally changing the relationship between your mind and the English language. Now, before we talk about how to break out of the trap, we need to understand what the alternative actually looks like from the inside. Because you cannot aim for something you cannot picture. What does it feel like to think in English? It feels like what you experience right now in your native language when you are having a comfortable, relaxed conversation with someone you know well. You do not think about what words to use. You do not construct sentences consciously. Ideas form and words come. There is no gap between the thought and the language. The language is the thought. That state is possible for you in English. It is not reserved for people who learned English as babies. It is not blocked off because you are an adult. It is a neurological possibility that exists for every human brain that is willing to do the specific kind of practice that makes it happen. And over the next 9 chapters, we are going to go through exactly what that practice looks like, step by step, layer by layer, until you have a complete picture of how to get there. But first, we need to go deeper into what fluency actually is, because most people have a completely wrong definition of it, and that wrong definition is part of what keeps them stuck. Chapter 2: What fluency actually is, and why your definition is keeping you stuck. If you asked 100 English learners what fluency means, the majority of them would give you some version of the same answer. They would say that fluency means speaking English without mistakes, or speaking English very fast, or knowing a very large vocabulary, or sounding like a native speaker. And those answers, while understandable, are almost entirely wrong. And the fact that so many learners define fluency this way explains why so many learners never actually become fluent. Let us be precise about what fluency actually is, because precision here is going to change how you practice. Fluency is not the absence of mistakes. Fluency is the uninterrupted flow of communication. Read that again. Fluency is not about being perfect. It is about being continuous. It is about the ability to keep language moving forward, naturally, without stopping, regardless of whether every word is exactly right. Think about fluent speakers you know. Not just English speakers, think about a fluent speaker of any language. Think about how they speak when they are talking to a friend, having a normal casual conversation. They make small errors sometimes. They choose slightly imperfect words sometimes. They repeat themselves, trail off mid-thought, start a sentence one way and finish it another way. They do all the messy human things that real speech involves. But they do not stop. They do not freeze. They do not go blank. The language flows. That is fluency. Now look at what happens when most learners try to speak English. The moment they sense they might be about to make a mistake, they stop. They go back. They second guess. They edit in their heads before speaking. They replace a word they are unsure of with silence while they search for a safer word. They are so focused on not being wrong that they sacrifice being understood. That focus on correctness over flow is itself one of the biggest barriers to fluency. And it is largely the product of a school environment where mistakes were marked wrong on tests and good performance meant 0 errors. The testing culture of traditional English education has created a generation of learners who are deeply, almost pathologically afraid of making mistakes in speech, which means they are afraid of speaking at all. Fluency requires you to make peace with imperfection. not to embrace sloppy language, not to give up on accuracy entirely, but to accept that in real communication, the flow matters more than the form. And that as you keep the flow going, the form improves naturally over time. Now let's look at the second wrong definition of fluency: speed. Many learners think that if they speak faster, they will sound more fluent. And so they rush. They race through sentences, dropping sounds, mumbling, skipping words, all in an effort to seem like a native speaker who speaks quickly. And the result is speech that is fast but impossible to understand. Speed is not fluency. In fact, many highly articulate native speakers speak at a moderate pace. They choose their words with some care. They pause for emphasis. They are not racing. They are communicating clearly and comfortably. What makes speech sound fluent is not the speed, it is the absence of unnatural pauses. A fluent speaker pauses at logical points, between ideas, for emphasis, for breath. A non-fluent speaker pauses randomly, mid-sentence, mid-thought, because the translation machine has stalled. The difference is not about how fast you speak. It is about where the breaks happen. Now let's address the third wrong definition: vocabulary size. There is a persistent belief among English learners that the reason they are not fluent is that they do not know enough words. And so they spend enormous amounts of time memorizing vocabulary lists, flashcards, apps, word-a-day calendars. And yes, vocabulary is important. Of course it is. But vocabulary size alone does not produce fluency. Here is the test for that. Think about the words you already know in English. Right now, as you are listening to this video, you are understanding everything being said. Every word. That means your passive vocabulary, the words you can understand when you hear or read them, is already quite substantial. You do not have a vocabulary problem. You have an access problem. The words are in your head. But when you try to speak, they are not available. They are stored somewhere deep in your passive knowledge, and you cannot retrieve them quickly enough to use them in real-time speech. And that retrieval problem is a separate issue from vocabulary size. It is about activation, turning passive knowledge into active, spontaneous use. And activation does not come from memorizing more words. It comes from a completely different kind of practice that we will cover in detail in a later chapter. Now, here is the definition of fluency that actually works, that is actually useful to you as a learner. Fluency is the state in which your dominant language system for communication shifts from your native language to English. That is it. That is the whole thing. Right now, your dominant language system, the default, automatic language that your brain uses when it forms thoughts, is your native language. Fluency means that in the context of English communication, English becomes that default system. Not instead of your native language, permanently. Not meaning you lose your native language or your culture. But meaning that when you are in an English conversation, your brain stops routing thoughts through the native language and starts generating them directly in English. When that shift happens even partially, even in limited contexts, everything changes. The pauses go away. The exhaustion goes away. The fear goes away. Speaking feels natural. You are not performing English. You are living in it. And that shift is entirely achievable. But it requires understanding exactly what kind of mental work produces it, which is what the rest of this video is built on. Let me say one more thing about fluency before we move on, because it is something almost no teacher or course ever mentions, and it is critically important. Fluency is not binary. It is not something you either have or do not have. It exists on a spectrum, and more importantly, it exists on a context spectrum. You can be fluent in one kind of English and not another. You can be fluent when discussing your own field of work, because you have used that vocabulary so many times in English that it has become automatic, but struggle badly when talking about something unfamiliar. This matters because it means you do not have to conquer all of English at once. You can build fluency strategically, context by context, topic by topic. And as each area of your English activates, as each domain of your experience starts to exist in English rather than through translation, the total fluency builds. Not all at once, but steadily, in a way that is completely within your control. Keep that thought in mind. We are going to come back to it. Chapter 3: The real reason you freeze mid-sentence. Have you ever been in the middle of saying something in English and felt the sentence just collapse? You started strong. The first few words came out. And then, somewhere in the middle, your brain just stopped. Nothing. Silence. And you either had to start the whole sentence over or give up and say something much simpler than what you actually meant. That experience, freezing mid-sentence, is one of the most frustrating and humiliating things an English learner goes through. And most people blame it on nerves, or lack of vocabulary, or simply not being good at English. But the real cause is something very specific, and understanding it will completely change how you react when it happens. The real reason you freeze mid-sentence is called cognitive overload, and it is a direct result of the translation process running out of capacity. Here is how it works. The human brain has what we can roughly call a working memory, a limited mental workspace where conscious thinking happens. When you are engaged in a task, working memory is what holds all the pieces of that task together while you work through them. It is like a mental whiteboard. But the whiteboard has a limited amount of space. It can only hold so much at once. When you are speaking in English through the translation process, your working memory is handling an enormous number of tasks simultaneously. It is holding the original thought in your native language. It is searching for the English translation of each key word. It is applying grammar rules, tense, word order, article usage, prepositions, plurals. It is monitoring the sentence as it comes out to make sure it sounds right. It is tracking what the other person is saying. It is managing your anxiety about whether you are performing well. It is processing social signals. Is the other person following you? Are they impatient? Do they look confused? That is a tremendous cognitive load. Far more than the human working memory is designed to handle simultaneously. And at some point, the system hits its limit. The whiteboard is full. Something has to give. And what gives, because it is the most recently added, most demanding, most dependent task, is the sentence construction process. The sentence collapses. You freeze. This is not a sign of low intelligence. It is not a sign that you are bad at English. It is a sign that you are trying to do too many things in your brain at the same time. And the reason those things are happening simultaneously is, again, the translation habit. A fluent speaker does not use working memory to construct sentences. Sentence construction, for a fluent speaker, is automatic. It runs in the background, outside of working memory, because it has been practiced so many times that it requires no conscious attention. This frees up all the mental bandwidth for the actual communication, the meaning, the social interaction, the content. When you eliminate translation, when you train your brain to generate English directly, you eliminate most of that cognitive load. And when the load is reduced, the freezing stops. There is another cause of mid-sentence freezing that we need to talk about, and it is connected to the first one but slightly different. It is called syntactic commitment anxiety. Here is what that means. Every language has a grammar. And every grammar has patterns, ways that sentences are structured, rules about where words go, rules about how verb tenses work, rules about when to use which preposition. When you start a sentence, you are committing to a grammatical path. The beginning of your sentence creates an expectation in your listener's mind and in your own about how it will end. For a native speaker, that commitment is effortless. They start a sentence and their automatic language system handles the structure without conscious input. They do not have to think about where the verb goes. It just goes there. For a non-native speaker who is consciously managing grammar, the commitment is terrifying. You start a sentence and then, halfway through, you realize you do not know how to finish it correctly. Or you started in the wrong tense. Or you used a word early in the sentence that now creates a grammatical problem later in the sentence. And instead of just continuing, just finishing the thought even imperfectly, you stop. Because your brain has been trained to stop when a mistake is coming. This is why many learners develop a habit of using very short, safe sentences. They unconsciously limit the complexity of what they say to stay within the grammatical territory they feel confident about. They use the same 5-sentence patterns over and over. They avoid complicated ideas not because they cannot think of them, but because they do not trust themselves to express them in English without making a mistake. And the result of that avoidance is that their English stays at the same level for years. Because you only improve at the things you actually try. And if you always play it safe, you never stretch your capacity. There is a third factor behind mid-sentence freezing that is more psychological than neurological, but it is just as powerful. It is performance anxiety. When you speak English in front of other people, especially native speakers, especially people you want to impress, especially in professional or academic settings, you are not just trying to communicate. You are performing. You are aware that you are being evaluated. And that awareness creates a second level of self-monitoring on top of the already heavy cognitive load of translation. You are not just trying to speak English. You are watching yourself speak English. Judging yourself as you go. Comparing your English to some ideal standard in your head. And that self-judgment takes up even more space in the already overloaded working memory. Psychologists call this divided attention. And research consistently shows that divided attention, trying to perform a task and monitor your performance simultaneously, degrades the quality of the task significantly. Musicians know this. Athletes know this. Public speakers know this. The moment you start watching yourself perform, the performance gets worse. The same is true for speaking. The solution is not to care less, that is not realistic advice when real stakes are involved. The solution is to reduce the translation load so dramatically that there is no cognitive overflow. When English becomes automatic enough, the self-monitoring can happen without crashing the system. There is enough bandwidth for both. But you have to get to that level of automaticity first. So let me summarize what we have established so far. You freeze mid-sentence because, 1, the translation process is consuming your entire working memory. 2, syntactic commitment anxiety is making you stop at every grammatical uncertainty. And 3, self-monitoring is adding an extra load on top of a system that is already overworked. All 3 of these causes have the same root, translation. And all 3 are solvable by the same method, systematically eliminating translation through the right kind of practice. But before we go there, I want to address something that almost every learner feels but almost nobody says out loud. And that is the shame dimension of freezing. When you freeze mid-sentence in front of other people, it is not just cognitively frustrating. It is emotionally painful. It is embarrassing. You feel exposed. You feel like your intelligence is being doubted. You feel like a child. And the next time an English conversation comes around, the memory of that freezing moment activates before anything else. The brain says, "This is a dangerous situation. Last time this happened, it hurt." And it turns up the anxiety even before the conversation begins. This is a psychological phenomenon called learned avoidance. When a stimulus, in this case, an English conversation, has been repeatedly associated with an unpleasant outcome, the freeze, the embarrassment, the brain begins to predict the unpleasant outcome before the stimulus even arrives. And the predicted discomfort drives avoidance behavior, declining opportunities to speak, giving minimal responses, defaulting to the easier option of staying silent. Learned avoidance is one of the main reasons why so many English learners stagnate at the intermediate level. They have enough English to get by in low-demand situations. They can read. They can write with time. But they systematically avoid the high-demand, real-time speaking situations that are precisely the contexts in which fluency grows. Because those contexts have hurt them before, and the brain has learned to stay away. Breaking out of learned avoidance requires both the cognitive solution, reducing the actual translation load so that freezing becomes less likely, and the psychological work of re-exposing yourself to feared contexts in controlled, graduated ways. Starting with lower-stakes speaking situations and building up. Having enough positive speaking experiences that the brain gradually updates its prediction. Learning to associate English speech not with exposure and failure, but with flow and genuine connection. The fear you feel about speaking English is not a character flaw. It is a completely rational response to years of a learning system that punished mistakes, a testing culture that evaluated performance, and social situations where communication failure carried real cost. You were trained to fear English mistakes. And that training was thorough. Undoing it takes time. But it is completely undoable. The learners who have made the most dramatic transformations in English fluency, the ones who went from silent, frozen, translation-heavy speakers to confident, natural, direct communicators, they all went through the same fear. None of them were born without it. All of them chose to walk through it anyway, one uncomfortable speaking moment at a time. Which means we need to go back further. We need to understand where translation comes from at an even deeper level, in your earliest language experiences, before we can fully understand how to dismantle it. Chapter 4: How the Mother Tongue Habit Was Built and What That Tells us About How to Break It. To understand how to break the translation habit, you need to understand how your native language was built into your brain in the first place. Because the method by which first language acquisition happened is the same method that produces real fluency in a second language, and it is almost entirely different from how most schools teach English. Think back to when you were a very young child learning to speak your native language. Not that you can consciously remember it, but think about the process that was happening. Nobody handed you a grammar textbook. Nobody gave you vocabulary lists to memorize. Nobody explained to you what a verb tense was, or showed you the difference between a subject and a predicate. None of that happened. And yet, by the age of 5 or 6, you were a fully functional speaker of your native language. You could produce sentences you had never heard before. You could understand complex ideas. You could express emotions, ask questions, tell stories, argue, persuade. How did that happen? It happened through massive, continuous, multisensory immersion in the language combined with a biological drive to make meaning. You heard language all day, every day, from the moment you were born. You heard it in the voices of the people who loved you. You heard it connected to actions. Someone said the word eat and then food appeared. Someone said the word no with a particular tone and you learned what that meant from the emotional context, from their face, from the consequence. Every word you acquired was connected not to another word in a different language, but to a direct experience. A feeling. A moment. A reality. You did not learn the word for hot by looking up its translation. You learned hot by touching something hot and hearing someone say that word as you experienced the sensation. The word and the experience fused together in your brain. They became the same thing. This process, learning language through direct connection between words and experience, without translation as an intermediary, is called direct association. And it is the neurological foundation of all genuine language fluency. Your native language has millions of these direct associations. Every word you know in your native language connects directly to memories, emotions, sensory experiences, situations. That is why your native language feels like part of you in a way that studied English never quite has. Because it is connected to your actual life. It is woven into your experience at a level that goes far below words. Now here is the critical point for you as an English learner. The problem is not that your brain cannot build those direct associations for English. Every human brain can. The problem is that you have been practicing English in a way that bypasses the direct association process entirely and uses translation instead. Every time you learned an English word by linking it to its native language equivalent and then used that native language word as the mental reference point for the English word, you were building a translation bridge instead of a direct association. You were building a system where English meaning is always accessed through your native language, not directly. And the more you practiced that system, the more automatic it became. Until now, after years of learning this way, the translation route is deeply worn and fast, and the direct association route for English barely exists. Here is the good news, and it is genuinely good. The brain is not fixed. It does not finish developing and then freeze in place. Neuroscience has spent the last several decades documenting something called neuroplasticity, the brain's lifelong ability to form new neural pathways, to change its own wiring in response to new experiences and new practice. The translation habit is not permanent. The neural pathways that produce it are not locked. They were built by practice, and they can be overridden, not erased, but overridden by building new pathways that are stronger, faster, and more automatic. But this requires a specific kind of practice. Not more grammar study. Not more vocabulary memorization. A fundamentally different approach to how you engage with the English language, which is built on the same principles that produced your native language fluency in the first place. Let me describe what those principles are, because this is the architecture of everything that follows. Principle 1: direct connection, not translation. Every English word you activate, every piece of English knowledge you convert from passive to active, must be connected directly to meaning, to experience, to images, to emotion. Not to its native language equivalent. When you encounter or use the English word overwhelmed, you should be connecting it to the feeling of being overwhelmed, the chest tightness, the mental fog, the sense of too much, not to whatever your native language word for that feeling is. The more you make that direct connection, the more your brain starts to access the English word directly rather than routing through translation. Principle 2: comprehensible input in massive quantities. The brain builds language from exposure. It detects patterns, grammar patterns, vocabulary patterns, rhythm patterns, automatically and unconsciously, through a process called implicit learning. This is how you acquired all the grammar of your native language without ever being taught it explicitly. You heard it thousands of times, your brain noticed the patterns, and eventually it generalized those patterns into rules that you apply automatically without conscious thought. For English to work the same way, you need massive input, listening and reading, at a level where you understand the meaning without needing to translate. When the language is comprehensible to you, when you can follow the meaning from context even if you do not know every word, the implicit learning system turns on. Your brain starts processing the grammar automatically. And over time, the patterns become part of your instinct. Principle 3: Output without rehearsal. You become fluent in speaking by speaking. This sounds obvious, but it is not, because there is a specific kind of speaking that builds fluency and a kind that does not. Rehearsed, planned, translated speaking does not build fluency. Spontaneous, unplanned, real-time speaking does. Because spontaneous speaking is the only context in which your brain is forced to generate English directly rather than translating. Every time you translate in preparation for speaking, you are reinforcing the translation habit. Every time you push yourself to speak without preparation, even badly, even imperfectly, you are forcing the direct generation system to activate. And the more it activates, the stronger it gets. Principle 4: Emotional and experiential richness. Language sticks when it is connected to genuine experience and genuine emotion. The words and structures you will remember forever are the ones you encountered in meaningful contexts, in stories that moved you, in conversations that mattered to you, in moments when English was the medium of something real. The language that will not stick is the language from exercises and drills that had no emotional or experiential weight. This is not a nice to have. It is a neurological necessity. Emotional relevance is one of the key signals the brain uses to decide what to consolidate into long-term memory and what to discard. Language that lives in a boring, context-free, translation-mediated environment will always be fragile. Language that lives in rich, meaningful, emotional contexts will become automatic. These 4 principles, direct connection, massive input, unrehearsed output, and emotional richness, are the blueprint for breaking the translation trap and building real English fluency. Everything in the remaining chapters of this video is an application of these principles. Keep them in mind as we go forward. Chapter 5: The Mental Switch: How to Begin Thinking in English. You have understood the problem. You understand the translation trap, what causes it, why it is so hard to break, and what the alternative looks like at a neurological level. Now we get practical. Now we start talking about what to actually do. The first and most important practical skill in breaking the translation trap is called the mental switch. It is the ability to shift your internal language, the language of your inner voice, your internal monologue, your ongoing silent self-talk, from your native language to English. Before you can speak in English without translating, you have to think in English without translating. The spoken word is just the audible surface of a much deeper cognitive process. If the process underneath is happening in your native language, the spoken output will always involve translation. But if you can shift the internal process into English even partially, even imperfectly, the spoken English starts to come naturally. Most people do not think about the fact that they have an internal language. That there is a voice in their head, their own voice, that narrates their experience, forms their thoughts, processes their decisions. That voice is almost certainly speaking your native language right now. And getting fluent in English means, fundamentally, convincing that voice to start operating in English. This is not as strange or as difficult as it sounds. And it does not mean losing your native language inner voice. Think of it like switching channels. Your native language channel is still there, always available. But you are developing the ability to switch to the English channel when you choose to, and eventually, in English contexts, to have that switch happen automatically. Here is how you start the mental switch process. I am going to give you 3 specific techniques, and all 3 of them should be practiced together. The first technique is stream of consciousness narration. This is exactly what it sounds like. You narrate your life, your moment-to-moment experience, in English, internally. As you go about your day, your inner voice describes what is happening in English. You are making coffee. You think, in English, I'm making coffee. It's too early. I didn't sleep well last night. The kitchen is cold. I need to buy more milk. These do not need to be complex thoughts. In fact, starting simple is exactly right. Simple English sentences about immediate experience are the foundation of direct association. You are linking English words directly to what you are seeing, doing, feeling, right now. No translation. No native language intermediary. Just English and experience, fused together. Some people find this awkward at first. The inner voice fights it. It defaults back to the native language because that is where it is comfortable. That is normal. Do not fight the native language thoughts when they arise. Just gently redirect. Notice that you are thinking in your native language and shift back to English. Every time you redirect, you are building the English channel a little stronger. Practice this every day. Start with 10 minutes in the morning, just narrating your morning routine in English in your head. Then expand it. Try to keep the English channel on for longer stretches. An hour. 2 hours. Eventually, try to make it through an entire day with your inner voice narrating primarily in English. You will fail at first. That is fine. Keep trying. The second technique is English-only thinking periods. These are dedicated times, at least 30 minutes, ideally 60 minutes per day, during which you commit to processing every thought that arises in English. Not just narrating your external experience, but actually thinking, planning, reflecting, deciding, evaluating in English. These periods are difficult because thinking is where your native language is most deeply rooted. Your opinions, your judgments, your feelings, these are all native language experiences. Accessing them in English requires a translation step that you have been doing your whole life. And the goal is to eliminate that step. One powerful approach is to take a topic, anything at all, and simply think about it in English for an extended period. Not writing about it. Not speaking about it. Just thinking about it, silently, in English. What do I think about this? What are the different aspects of this issue? What is my opinion? What do I know about this topic that I could explain to someone? At first, you will hit walls. You will reach for a word in English and not find it. You will think of an idea that you can express perfectly in your native language and struggle to find the English version. When this happens, and this is important, do not translate. Instead, talk around the gap. Find another way to express the idea in English, even if it is less precise, even if it is less eloquent. This workaround practice is crucial because it is exactly what real-time English speaking requires. In real conversations, you will not always have the perfect word. You need to be able to reach for an approximation without stopping. The third technique is English microjournaling. Each day, write down 10 to 15 sentences in English about your day. Not a formal essay. Not a structured report. Just raw, honest, conversational notes about what happened, how you felt, what you thought. The same way you might text a friend. The reason for this is that writing is slower than speaking, which gives your English thinking system more time to generate content. It is a kind of training ground for the mental switch. You are practicing thinking in English in a medium where you have more time, which builds the neural pathways more safely before you apply them in the more demanding context of real-time speech. Over time, as the journal entries come more easily, you will notice that your spoken English is also becoming more accessible. The same pathways you are building through writing are the ones that activate during speech. Now, I need to be honest with you about how this process feels in the early stages, because if I do not, you will give up when it gets hard. Thinking in English in the early stages is slow, frustrating. You will feel stupid. You will feel like you are regressing rather than progressing, because the thoughts that come out in English are much simpler and less sophisticated than the thoughts you can express effortlessly in your native language. This is normal. This is not regression. This is the rebuilding stage. When you start thinking in English, you are using a much younger, much less developed language system. Your English is not yet at the level of your native language in terms of its access to nuance, depth, and complexity. And feeling that gap, feeling like a child compared to your native language self, is uncomfortable. But here is the thing. Every adult who has ever become truly fluent in his second language has gone through exactly this stage. Every person who now thinks, dreams, and feels naturally in their second language once went through the phase of feeling stupid and simple when they tried to think in that language. The discomfort is the sign that the rewiring is working. Push through it. Let me also address a question that many learners have at this stage, because it is a practical and important one. How do you know if the mental switch is actually working? How do you measure progress when what you are trying to change is invisible, an internal process, a habit of thought? There are several observable signs that the mental switch is happening. The first is speed of response. As the English inner voice gets stronger, your response time in English conversations gets shorter. The gap between hearing a question and beginning to answer, that thinking pause, starts to close. Not because you are rushing, but because there is less translation work happening. The second sign is reduced fatigue. Translation is mentally exhausting. As the translation load reduces, English conversation becomes less tiring. You can hold longer conversations without the mental depletion that you used to feel. You can engage with more complex ideas for longer periods. The energy that was going to the translation machine is now available for the actual communication. The third sign is accessing emotion in English. This is a subtle but profound marker of real progress. For most non-native speakers, emotions are felt and processed in the native language. When something wonderful or terrible happens, the emotional response happens in the native language. But as the mental switch deepens, you begin to have emotional responses that register in English, not just labeled in English, but actually experienced and processed there. You feel the humor of an English joke directly, without running it through your native language first. You feel the sadness of an English story directly, without translating it. When emotions start to happen in English, that is when you know the mental switch has taken hold at a deep level. The fourth and most obvious sign is that you catch yourself thinking in English when you had no intention of practicing. You are doing something mundane and you realize your internal commentary is in English. Or you see something funny and your first thought is in English. Or you have a strong opinion about something and it forms in English before it forms in your native language. These moments, unforced, unplanned, spontaneous English thoughts, are the neural rewiring becoming visible. They are proof that the pathways you have been building are getting strong enough to fire on their own, without conscious effort. Note them. Celebrate them. They are the beginning of what you are building toward. Chapter 6, The Spontaneity Skill, Speaking Without Preparing. Here is one of the most common and crippling patterns I see in English learners, and I want you to recognize it in yourself if it applies. Before you speak, you prepare. You think the sentence through in your head, usually in your native language, then translate it, then check it mentally, then deliver it. And if you do not have enough time to complete that process, if the conversation is moving too fast, if someone asks you something unexpected, if you need to respond immediately, you either freeze, or you say something much simpler than what you intended, or you avoid speaking altogether. This preparation habit is the spoken version of the translation trap. And it is so deeply ingrained in most learners that they do not even realize they are doing it. It feels like care. It feels like diligence. It feels like trying to be accurate. But what it actually is a barrier between you and real English communication. The spontaneity skill is the ability to speak English without that preparation step. To open your mouth and let the English come out without first constructing it in your head. And while that sounds terrifying, and initially it is the single most direct path to breaking the translation habit in speaking. Here is why preparation hurts you. Every time you prepare a sentence before speaking, you are rehearsing the translation process. You are making that translation route deeper and faster. You are teaching your brain that English speaking requires translation. You are reinforcing the very habit you want to break. Every time you speak without preparation, even badly, even incompletely, even with errors, you are forcing your brain to attempt direct English generation. And even when that attempt fails and you stumble, the attempt itself is training the right neurological process. You are nudging your brain toward a new habit. This does not mean you should speak carelessly. It means you should practice speaking spontaneously in safe environments, contexts where imperfection has no real consequences, so that you build the spontaneity capacity before you need it in high-stakes situations. Here are the specific practices that build the spontaneity skill. The first practice is called impromptu speaking drills. You give yourself a random topic, any topic. Pick one at random, use a random word generator if you like, and you speak about it in English for 2 full minutes without stopping. No preparation. No planning. You do not decide what you are going to say before you start. You just start talking, and you keep talking, and you use whatever English comes. It does not matter what you say. It does not matter if the thoughts are coherent. It does not matter if you repeat yourself, stumble over words, or trail off mid-thought. What matters is that you keep going for the full 2 minutes without stopping to translate, without editing in your head, without silence while you search for words. If you cannot find the word you want, you use a different word. If you lose the thread of what you were saying, you start a new thread. But you do not stop. This practice is brutally uncomfortable for most people. The first few times you do it, the English that comes out will be ugly. Short sentences. Repeated words. Ideas that do not connect. And your critical mind will want to intervene, slow down, and make it better. Do not let it. The critical mind is the translation machine. Keep it out. Over time, after weeks of this practice, something remarkable happens. The spontaneous English gets better. Without correction. Without editing. Because your brain is learning, through the pressure of real-time speech, to generate English more directly and more efficiently. The second practice is fast response conversation. This is best done with a partner, a language exchange partner, a tutor, a friend who speaks English, but you can also simulate it alone. The idea is to respond to questions or prompts as quickly as possible. The moment you hear the question, you start speaking. No pause. No preparation. Whatever comes out, comes out. The shortness of the response time is what creates the training effect. Because when you must respond immediately, the translation machine does not have time to complete its process. Your brain is forced to attempt something else, to reach for English directly, to pull words from whatever intuitive English sense you have developed so far. And every time it does that, the intuitive English sense gets a little stronger. The questions for this practice should be genuinely random and genuinely varied. Not prepared questions you know are coming. The surprise is part of what makes it work. What did you eat for breakfast? What is the most interesting thing you have ever seen? Where would you go if you could go anywhere right now? What is something people misunderstand about you? Random, varied, fast. The third practice is what I call English improv, taking a cue from the world of improvisational theater. Improv theater has a famous rule: yes, and. When a scene partner gives you something, you accept it and build on it. You do not reject, you do not revise, you do not pause and reconsider. You take what was given and you add to it. Keep the scene moving. Keep the momentum going. This is exactly the mindset that spontaneous English speaking requires. Whatever English comes to you, however imperfect, however incomplete, accept it and build on it. Do not reject the sentence halfway through because it is not perfect. Do not revise mid-utterance because you realized a better word. Take what your brain offers you and run with it. When you practice this mindset, your relationship to your own English output changes fundamentally. You stop being the judge of your English and start being its user. And the moment you start using English instead of judging it, the moment the language becomes a tool rather than a performance, it starts to improve faster than at any other time. There is one more thing I want to say about spontaneity, and it is about the role of silence. Silence in conversation has a very different meaning in different cultures. In some cultures, pausing before responding is a sign of respect and thoughtfulness. In others, it feels uncomfortable. But in English conversation, particularly in professional or casual Western contexts, long pauses while you translate feel awkward. The listener may interpret them as hesitation, confusion, or discomfort. One of the most powerful techniques for managing this is learning to use what linguists call thinking out loud, verbal fillers that are genuinely natural in English and that buy you a small amount of processing time without creating an awkward silence. Phrases like, "That's a great question, let me think about that for a second." Or, "So, what I would say is." Or, "It's interesting because." These are not stalling tactics. These are what native speakers actually use. They are natural parts of English discourse. And they serve a dual purpose. They maintain the flow of conversation while giving your brain a half second of extra time to find the next thought. Learn these phrases. Make them automatic. Use them freely. They are not signs of weakness, they are signs of fluency. Because only someone who has enough English to naturally deploy thinking out loud can use them convincingly. Here is a list of the most useful English thinking out loud phrases that you should internalize completely. Not memorize as isolated items, but genuinely internalize, meaning you have used them enough times that they come without thought. That's a really interesting question. This is your opening stall for any question that surprises you. It buys 2 full seconds and signals intelligence and engagement at the same time. Let me think about how to put this. This one is honest and natural. You are not pretending you have the answer ready. You are being genuine while holding the floor. I guess what I'm trying to say is, this one is enormously useful mid-sentence when the sentence is collapsing. You restart, you reframe, and you keep going. You know what I mean? Or does that make sense? These are check-ins that invite the listener to confirm understanding, which also briefly relieves the pressure on you to perform continuously. It's kind of like, this phrase introduces an analogy or approximation, which is perfect for when you do not have the exact word but you can describe the concept from a different angle. What I mean is, or in other words, these are reformulation signals. When your first attempt at a sentence does not land right, instead of abandoning it, you use one of these to rephrase and try again. This is what native speakers do constantly. It is not failure, it is natural discourse management. Practice these phrases until they are as automatic as breathing. Drill them not in isolation but by creating situations where you deploy them. Use them in your morning speaking practice. Use them in your improv drills. Use them so many times that when you are in a real conversation and the translation machine stalls, your mouth is already moving with one of these phrases while your brain catches up. And finally, let me address the mindset dimension of spontaneity, because without this piece, the techniques alone will not hold. Spontaneous speaking requires a fundamental shift in what you are trying to accomplish in an English conversation. Most learners approach English speech with one dominant goal: to not make mistakes, to sound correct, to be evaluated well, to protect themselves from the embarrassment of getting it wrong. Spontaneous English speaking requires replacing that goal with a different one: to communicate, to connect, to exchange meaning with another human being. When the goal shifts from performance to communication, everything changes. The self-monitoring reduces because you are focused outward, on the other person and the meaning, rather than inward on your own performance. The fear reduces because you are not trying to pass a test, you are trying to talk to someone. And paradoxically, when you stop performing and start communicating, the English actually sounds better. More natural. More like you. The best English you will ever speak will be in a conversation where you forgot that you were speaking English. Where you were so absorbed in what you were saying, so invested in the idea, the story, the connection, that the language took care of itself. That state is not luck. It is the destination that all of this practice is building toward. Chapter 7: Vocabulary that thinks for you, building automatic word access. Earlier in this video, I told you that your problem is not vocabulary size. And that is true. But vocabulary is still important, just not in the way most people think. The issue is not how many words you know. The issue is how many words you can access automatically, without effort, in real-time speech. This distinction between knowing a word and being able to use it spontaneously is one of the most critical and most overlooked distinctions in the entire field of language learning. And understanding it changes everything about how you should build your vocabulary. Think about the difference between two English learners. The first learner has studied 5,000 English words. They have memorized each one from a list. They know the translation of each word. If you give them a gap fill exercise, they can fill in most of the blanks correctly. But when they speak, they use a much smaller set of words, maybe 300 or 400 at most, because those are the only words that come to them quickly enough to use in real-time speech. The second learner has studied 3,000 English words. But they have encountered each word repeatedly in context, in stories, in conversations, in videos. They have seen each word in multiple different settings. They have used many of them in their own speaking. Their vocabulary is smaller on paper, but in practice, almost all of it is accessible. When they speak, they can reach for words from nearly their entire vocabulary and find them quickly. The second learner is more fluent. Not because they know more, but because what they know, they own. This is what we mean by automatic word access. A word is automatically accessible when you do not need to consciously search for it, when it comes to you the way your own name comes to you when someone asks, instantly and effortlessly. And that automaticity is built not through memorization, but through repeated meaningful exposure and use. Here is the principle behind it, which connects back to what we discussed in Chapter 4. Every word exists in your mental lexicon, your internal dictionary, as a node. And that node is connected to a network of associations, sounds, contexts, emotions, related words, situations where you have heard or used the word. The richer and more numerous those connections, the faster and easier it is to access the word. A word that you know only from a vocabulary list has one or two connections, its translation, and maybe its definition. It is a thin, isolated node. When you try to retrieve it under the pressure of real-time speech, the signal that reaches it is weak and the retrieval is slow. A word that you have encountered many times in context, that you have heard in stories, seen in conversations, used yourself, connected to emotions and experiences, has a rich network of connections. The retrieval signal reaches it from multiple directions. It fires easily, quickly, automatically. So the path to automatic vocabulary is repeated exposure in varied meaningful contexts. Not repetition in the sense of drilling the same word list over and over. Repetition in the sense of encountering the word in different real language contexts, different speakers, different situations, different emotional registers, multiple times, over time. This is why reading and listening extensively in English is so foundational to fluency. It is not just about absorbing new vocabulary. It is about re-encountering vocabulary you already know in fresh contexts, thickening the associative networks, strengthening the access pathways. But there is a further dimension to this that most people miss. When you encounter a word passively in reading or listening, you build recognitional knowledge of it. You know it when you see or hear it. But to use it in speech, you need productive knowledge, you need to be able to generate it. And generating a word is harder than recognizing it. The access pathway needs to go in both directions. Building productive vocabulary requires output actually using words in your own speaking and writing. And the most effective way to build productive vocabulary is to deliberately choose to use new words in your output before they feel fully natural. To reach for a word you know but have not quite owned yet, and use it. Even awkwardly. Even unsurely. Because that act of reaching and using is what converts the word from passive knowledge to active, automatic use. This is the opposite of playing it safe. It requires deliberately choosing the word you are not yet confident with instead of the safe word you always default to. It requires accepting the discomfort of using language that is at the edge of your current fluency. And it is precisely at that edge that fluency growth happens. Let me give you a specific framework for building a vocabulary that thinks for you. The framework has 3 stages. Stage 1 is acquisition. You encounter a new word in context. You understand its meaning from context, not from a translation, but from the surrounding information. You get a feel for it. What kind of situations does it appear in? What emotion or tone does it carry? Who uses it and when? You do not need to explicitly memorize it. Just absorb it through the context. Stage 2 is recognition. You encounter the word again in a different context, through a different medium. You recognize it from your first encounter. You understand it even faster now. Each subsequent encounter thickens the network around the word. Stage 3 is production. You use the word in your own speech or writing. You reach for it in a context where it fits, even if you are not 100% certain you are using it correctly. You take the risk. This is the critical stage because this is when the word crosses over from passive to active. Most vocabulary practice stops at stage 1, or at best stage 2. The third stage, production, actual use under conditions of spontaneity and imperfection, is where the real work happens. And most learners never get there with most of their vocabulary because they never try to use a word until they feel completely certain about it. And they never feel certain about it because they have never used it. It is a circular trap. Break the trap. Use the word imperfectly before you are ready. That is how the vocabulary becomes yours. Now let me talk about a specific category of vocabulary that is disproportionately important for fluency, because this is something most learners undervalue dramatically. It is called chunked language, multi-word expressions, fixed phrases, collocations, and idioms. Most vocabulary instruction focuses on individual words. But real English is not primarily made of individual words assembled according to grammar rules. Real English, the way native speakers actually speak, is made largely of prefabricated chunks. Phrases that come as units. Combinations of words that are always or almost always used together. Phrases like make a decision, not do a decision, or take a decision, but make. Or pay attention, not give attention, or put attention, but pay. Or it depends on, not it depends from, or it depends of, but on. These are collocations. They are word combinations that native speakers have internalized and produce automatically as single units. Idioms are another form of chunked language. Bite the bullet, get the hang of it, on the fence. Each of these is a single mental unit for a native speaker. They do not assemble these phrases word by word. They retrieve the whole phrase as one piece. And discourse markers, the connective tissue of spoken English, are equally important. To be honest, as far as I know, here's the thing, you know what I'm saying, at the end of the day. These phrases manage the flow of conversation, signal the speaker's attitude, and maintain social connection. They are enormously common in real spoken English and almost entirely absent from formal vocabulary instruction. When you learn and practice chunked language, several powerful things happen. First, your speech sounds dramatically more natural. Because you are using the phrases that real speakers use, in the way that real speakers use them. Second, your fluency increases immediately. Because chunks are retrieved as single units as fast as single words. Instead of assembling 4 separate words in the right order, you access the whole phrase in one cognitive move. This dramatically reduces the processing time and load per unit of meaning. Third, and most importantly for our purposes, chunks help short-circuit translation. Because when you have a chunk fully internalized, you do not translate it. You do not look up each word and reassemble. You access the whole thing directly. And every time that happens, every chunk you retrieve directly, without translation, you are training direct English access. So invest significant time and attention in acquiring chunked language. Not through memorization lists, but by noticing chunks in your input in the English you read and listen to, and then practicing using them deliberately in your own output. Chapter 8, Grammar Without Thinking, Making Accuracy Instinctive. Grammar is the subject that most English learners have the most complicated relationship with. They have studied it extensively. They know the rules, many of them, anyway. They can explain what the present perfect is, when to use it versus the simple past, what the third conditional means, how relative clauses work. They have the knowledge. But when they speak, none of that knowledge comes fast enough to be useful. By the time they have consciously applied the grammar rule, the moment has passed. And so they either guess and hope, or they default to simple structures that they feel confident about, or they freeze. This is the grammar paradox. Knowing grammar rules does not produce accurate grammar in speech. And yet accuracy in grammar is important for being understood, for sounding educated, for professional communication. So how do you resolve this paradox? The resolution is understanding the difference between declarative grammar knowledge and procedural grammar knowledge. Declarative knowledge is knowledge about something. It is explicit, conscious, verbal. When you can state the rule, the present perfect is formed with have plus the past participle and is used for actions with present relevance, that is declarative knowledge. Procedural knowledge is knowledge of how to do something. It is implicit, automatic, non-verbal. When you can use the present perfect correctly without thinking about the rule, without consciously retrieving and applying it, that is procedural knowledge. In academic settings, grammar instruction almost exclusively builds declarative knowledge. You learn the rule. You practice applying the rule in controlled exercises. You get tested on the rule. And the result is a detailed mental library of grammar rules that you can explain fluently and a level of actual speech accuracy that lags far behind your explicit knowledge. Procedural grammar knowledge is built completely differently. It is built through massive exposure to correctly formed English, so much exposure that the brain's pattern recognition system implicitly learns the grammar patterns without needing explicit rules. And through output, attempting to use language spontaneously and getting feedback over time, the procedural system gradually refines itself. This is exactly how you acquired the grammar of your native language. You did not learn it as rules. You absorbed it as patterns. And now those patterns are so deeply proceduralized that you apply them without any conscious thought at all. You never think about where the verb goes in your native language. You just know. Not because you memorized the rule, but because you have heard and produced the pattern tens of thousands of times. The path to procedural grammar in English is the same path. Not memorizing more rules. Not doing more grammar exercises. But getting more correctly formed English into your brain through extensive listening and reading, and then using the language in real speaking as much as possible. Does this mean grammar study is useless? No. Explicit grammar knowledge plays a role, particularly in the editing of written language, where you have the time to apply conscious rules. And it can serve as a useful shortcut when implicit learning alone would take a very long time to produce a pattern. But explicit grammar rules are useful only when they connect to your intuitive sense of the language. When you have encountered a grammatical structure hundreds of times in real input, and then you learn the explicit rule that describes it, that is when the rule actually helps. Because you can connect it to a pattern you already feel instinctively, and the rule becomes a label for something real, not an abstract formula. When you study a grammar rule without having the underlying intuitive sense of the structure, you are building declarative knowledge with no procedural foundation, and that declarative knowledge will never convert itself into automatic speaking performance, no matter how well you can explain it on a test. So here is the practical guidance for grammar. First, prioritize input over rules. For every hour you spend studying grammar explicitly, spend at least 5 hours listening to and reading naturally formed English. The implicit learning system is more powerful than the explicit system for building speaking accuracy. Feed it. Second, notice grammar in input, do not analyze it. When you encounter a grammatical structure in what you are reading or listening to, pause and notice it. Feel the pattern. Understand why it is constructed the way it is, in context, from the inside, not from a rule applied from the outside. This noticing practice is what connects implicit and explicit grammar knowledge. Third, use grammar targets in output. Identify 1 or 2 grammar patterns that you want to internalize and deliberately use them in your speaking and writing every day. not in controlled grammar exercises, in real communication. If you are working on the third conditional, use it in your daily English journaling. Use it in your impromptu speaking drills. Find natural opportunities to deploy it. Every genuine use of a structure takes it one step further down the path from declarative to procedural. Fourth, do not self-correct while speaking. This is a hard one, because the urge to fix mistakes as you make them feels like diligence. But mid-utterance self-correction breaks the flow, reinforces the monitoring habit, and does not actually improve your accuracy in the long run. If you make a mistake while speaking, notice it, move on, and make a mental note to pay attention to that structure in your input later. Real improvement in speaking accuracy comes from the input-output cycle over time, not from corrections made in the heat of speech. Fifth, embrace approximation. When you cannot produce the grammatically perfect form, produce the nearest approximation and keep going. The communicative intent is more important than the grammatical form in most real-world interactions. A learner who says, "Yesterday I go to the market," has communicated successfully, even if the form is wrong. A learner who falls silent because they cannot remember if it should be "went" or "gone" has communicated nothing. Move toward accuracy over time, but never let the pursuit of accuracy stop communication now. Let me add one more layer to the grammar discussion, because it connects directly to the translation problem and it is critically important. Some of the most persistent grammar errors that English learners make are not random. They follow a predictable pattern based on the grammar of the learner's native language. Linguists call this transfer, when a structure from your native language gets mapped onto English because your brain defaults to what it knows. If your native language puts the adjective after the noun, you will habitually put it after the noun in English. If your native language does not use articles, you will forget them in English. If your native language uses one verb tense where English uses several, you will collapse English tense distinctions into the simpler native pattern. These transfer errors are not random. They are predictable. And because they are predictable, they are addressable. If you know where your native language tends to produce transfer errors in English, you can pay targeted attention to those specific areas in your input and output. For most learners, the areas most affected by transfer are articles, prepositions, verb tenses and aspect, and word order in questions. These are the areas where English grammar diverges most sharply from many other languages' grammars, and where the translation machine's default behavior produces the most consistent errors. Pay special attention to these areas. Seek out targeted input podcasts, videos, books, where these structures appear frequently in natural contexts. Notice them. Feel them. And gradually, through that noticing and that feeling, the instinctive correct form will emerge. Chapter 9, the daily rewiring practice, exactly what to do, every single day. Everything we have covered in this video comes down to this chapter. This is where theory becomes practice. Where understanding becomes action. Where knowing what the problem is becomes actually solving it. I am going to give you a complete daily practice structure. This is not a general suggestion. This is specific. It is designed based on every principle we have discussed: direct association, massive input, spontaneous output, chunked language, procedural grammar. Every element of this structure has a reason. Before I lay it out, let me say one thing clearly. This practice is not designed to add enormous extra time to your day. It is designed to replace the time you are already spending on ineffective English learning, the vocabulary app you scroll through on autopilot, the grammar exercises that never seem to stick, the YouTube videos in English where you keep reaching for the subtitle button, with time spent on practices that actually change your brain. You do not need more time. You need different activity. The total daily practice I am recommending is 90 minutes to 2 hours. This is split across the day, not necessarily done all at once. In fact, it should not be done all at once, because spaced practice produces better neurological outcomes than massed practice. Here is the structure. Block 1 Morning, Inner English Activation. 15 to 20 minutes. This is the first thing you do in the morning, before your day gets busy. It has 2 parts. Part 1, 5 minutes of English inner monologue. The moment you wake up, before you look at your phone, before you do anything else, start narrating your experience in English in your head. How am I feeling? What day is it? What do I have to do today? What am I thinking about? Simple thoughts, simple sentences, in English. You are turning on the English channel first thing in the morning and establishing it as the language of your day from the very start. Part 2, 10 to 15 minutes of impromptu speaking. Choose a topic random, picked without thought, and speak about it in English for the full time. Record yourself. Not to review the recording and cringe at mistakes, but to create a habit of production. The act of recording creates a social accountability context that slightly increases the pressure, which is exactly what you need to simulate real conversation conditions without the full social risk. Do not choose topics you feel comfortable with every time. Push yourself into territory that challenges your vocabulary, your grammar, your knowledge. Uncomfortable topics are where the growth happens. Block 2, throughout the day, passive input. 60 to 90 minutes total, integrated into other activities. This is your listening time. It should happen during activities that do not require your full cognitive attention: commuting, exercising, doing household tasks, walking, cooking. Listen to English content that is slightly challenging but largely comprehensible. Podcasts are ideal. Audiobooks work well. Narrative content, stories, discussions, interviews is better than instructional content, because narrative keeps you engaged at the meaning level rather than at the analytical level. The rule is, no subtitles. No pausing to look up words. No native language translation of confusing parts. Let the stream of English wash over you. Understand as much as you can from context. When you do not understand something, let it go and keep listening. Your brain is absorbing patterns whether you consciously notice them or not. Trust the implicit learning process. Do not multitask heavily during this block. You can walk or do simple tasks, but keep the cognitive load of the accompanying activity low so that your brain has bandwidth to process the language. Block 3, midday, active reading. 20 to 30 minutes. Read something in English. Not a grammar textbook. Not a learner's reader. Something real: an article, a chapter of a novel, a blog, a newspiece in authentic English, at a level that challenges you but does not defeat you. While you read, practice the noticing technique. When you encounter a phrase or structure that feels natural or that surprises you, pause on it for a moment. Feel the pattern. Understand why it is constructed the way it is. You are not analyzing it academically. You are sensing it, adding it to your intuitive grammar and vocabulary knowledge. Keep a small notebook for chunks. When you encounter a phrase that you want to own, an idiom, a collocation, a discourse marker, a turn of phrase that strikes you as natural and useful, write it down. Not its translation. Write it down in English, with the sentence it came from. After your reading session, review the chunks and try to use 3 of them in a spoken sentence. Block 4, evening, English output session. 20 to 30 minutes. This is your production block, and it is the most important block of the day. Choose one of the following activities and rotate through them on different days. Option 1. English conversation. With a language exchange partner, a tutor, or a study group. The conversation should be genuinely communicative, not scripted, not planned, not roleplay with fixed vocabulary. Real topics. Real interaction. Real spontaneous speech. Option 2. English video creation. Record a short video, 2 to 5 minutes, in English on any topic. Upload it, keep it private if you prefer, but create it and watch it once. Not to criticize your mistakes, but to observe your growth. Option 3. English journaling. Write 15 to 20 sentences about your day, your thoughts, something you read, something you heard. In full conversational English. This is your private space, no judgment, no editing, no need for perfection. Just English output, flowing. Option 4. Shadowing practice. Find a short piece of English audio, a podcast clip, a speech excerpt, a scene from a show, and shadow it. Shadowing means listening to the audio and speaking along with it simultaneously, mimicking the exact sounds, rhythm, stress, and intonation of the speaker. This is one of the most powerful tools for building the prosody, the music of English, which is what makes your speech sound natural rather than robotic. Block 5. Before sleep, English review and consolidation. 10 minutes. Before you go to sleep, review the chunk notebook from the day. Read through the phrases you collected and try to use each one in a sentence out loud if possible, in your head if not. Think about the English input you had during the day and recall one moment, one phrase, one sentence, one idea that stayed with you. Hold that in your mind as you fall asleep. Sleep plays a crucial role in memory consolidation, and what you think about right before sleep has a disproportionate impact on what gets consolidated. Also review the record of your morning speaking session. Not to criticize, just to notice any patterns. Are there certain topics where you flow more easily? Certain grammatical structures that keep tripping you up? Use these observations to guide your practice the next day. Now, beyond the daily structure, there are several important notes on how to handle the most common obstacles you will face during this practice. The first obstacle is what I call the motivation cliff. In the first few days of a new practice, motivation is high. Everything feels fresh. You are excited about the change. You are consistent. But around day 10 or 14, the novelty wears off. The results are not yet dramatic enough to fuel the initial excitement. And suddenly the practice feels like a burden. This is normal. Every person who has ever built a deep skill has gone through the motivation cliff. And the learners who cross it are not the ones with more willpower or more passion, they are the ones who built the habit into their routine so thoroughly that it does not require motivation to activate. It just happens because it is part of the day, the same way brushing your teeth is part of the day. This is why the blocks in this practice are designed to fit around existing activities. The listening block happens during your commute, which you were doing anyway. The morning block happens before you check your phone, a moment that already exists. A habit must latch onto existing structure or it will fall apart under its own weight when motivation drops. The second obstacle is the comparison trap. At some point in your practice, you will hear or see an English speaker, a native speaker, maybe, or a very advanced non-native speaker, and compare yourself to them. And the comparison will feel crushing. They sound so natural, so effortless, so far ahead. And the voice in your head will say, "I will never get there." Do not compare yourself to other speakers. Compare yourself to your own past. The only meaningful measure of your progress is the distance between where you were 6 months ago and where you are today. And if you are practicing honestly and consistently, that distance will be real, even when it does not feel like enough. Record yourself speaking at the start of your practice. Keep the recording. Listen to it again 3 months later. The difference will be clearer than any comparison to someone else's English could ever tell you. The third obstacle is what I call input overload. Not all English input is created equal for rewiring purposes. Some learners make the mistake of consuming such a high volume of English input, hours and hours of podcasts, videos, shows, that the volume itself becomes a kind of distraction. They are consuming English, but they are not building anything from it because they are not engaged at the meaning level, and they are not connecting the input to any output. Quality of engagement matters as much as quantity of input. 45 minutes of deeply engaged, meaning-focused listening where your full attention is on understanding the content, where you are tracking the ideas, following the logic, feeling the language, is worth more than 3 hours of English playing in the background while you browse social media. The implicit learning system turns on when you are genuinely trying to understand. It does not turn on when you are passively exposed. Be intentional with your input. Choose content that genuinely interests you. Give it your full attention. And balance the volume of input with deliberate output sessions, because without output, the input has nowhere to go. Now, beyond the daily structure, there are several larger principles that govern how this practice should evolve over time. The first principle is progressive challenge. Every few weeks, take stock of where your English is and consciously increase the difficulty of your practice. Find input that is slightly harder than what you are currently using. Choose speaking topics that push you further. Increase the spontaneity requirements. If you are always comfortable in your practice, you have stopped growing. The second principle is consistency over intensity. 90 minutes every single day is worth far more than 8 hours once a week. The brain rewires through consistent, repeated activation of the new pathways, not through occasional intense effort. Do not wait for large blocks of time to practice. Build the practice into the texture of every day. The third principle is real-world application. All of the practice in the world has limited value if it never connects to real English communication. Find opportunities to use your English in real contexts, at work, online, in communities, in travel, in any interaction where English is the medium. The real world provides a quality of feedback and motivation that no practice environment can fully replicate. The fourth principle is patience without complacency. The mental rewiring process takes time. It will not be complete in a week or a month. Real fluency, the kind where you are thinking in English naturally, where there is no translation, where English and self are integrated, takes sustained practice over a significant period. Accept that timeline. Do not be impatient with slow progress. But also do not accept stagnation. If you have been practicing consistently for 3 months and feel no change at all, something in your practice needs adjustment. The fifth principle is joy. This might seem out of place in a rigorous practice plan, but it is not. Language acquisition is dramatically more effective when the learner is genuinely engaged, genuinely interested, genuinely enjoying the content they are consuming and the communication they are having. If your English input is boring to you, change it. Use English to access content about things that genuinely fascinate you. Build English into activities you would want to do regardless of language learning. Because when the brain is engaged and enjoying itself, the neuroplasticity that produces language acquisition runs at full power. Chapter 10: The New You Life After the Translation Mode is Broken. We have covered the problem in depth. We have covered the neuroscience of how translation forms, how it traps you, how it produces every symptom you have experienced: the freezing, the fatigue, the stiff robotic sentences, the loss of personality in English. We have covered the principles that break the habit. We have given you the daily practice that rewires the brain. Now I want to talk about what comes after. What the other side actually looks like. Because when you have been stuck in a problem long enough, it becomes hard to imagine life without it. And imagining the destination, feeling it, wanting it, believing in it is more important to the journey than most people realize. So let me paint a picture. There is a moment that happens for language learners, a moment that people who have been through it describe with a kind of reverence that we call the click. It does not happen all at once. It does not happen on a specific day where you wake up and suddenly you are fluent. But there comes a point in the rewiring process where something shifts. Where a conversation in English suddenly feels different. Where you realize, mid-conversation, that you have been speaking for 5 minutes without translating once. Where the English is just coming, and you are not driving it consciously, it is driving itself. The first time this happens, it is almost shocking. It can feel unreal. Because it is so different from everything you have experienced before in English, so opposite to the exhausting, laboring, translation-heavy communication you are used to, that it takes a moment to trust it. And then you start to notice it more. The flow comes more often. In shorter, easier conversations first, then in longer, more complex ones. In topics you know well first, then in new territory. The fluency expands, context by context, topic by topic, until it becomes your new default. What does life look like in that state? It looks like this. You are in a meeting at work. Someone asks for your input on something. And instead of the familiar internal scramble, the translation, the construction, the second-guessing, you just respond. The words are there. They come out in order. They make sense. You sound like yourself. Not like a translation of yourself, but like yourself in English. You are at a social event, talking to someone from another country. The conversation moves fast, bounces between topics, involves humor and wordplay and cultural references. And you are there, in it, present, not half present because half your brain is running the translation machine, but fully present because the language is automatic and all your mental energy is available for the meaning. You are reading a book in English and you get to the end of a chapter and realize you did not translate a single word. You read the whole chapter directly in English. The images in your mind formed from the English words, not from their translations. The emotion of the story reached you through English, not through the detour of your native language. You have a dream in English. This last one might sound trivial, but it is not. Dreams happen in the language that your deeper mind has access to. When you dream in English, when the English has become deep enough to penetrate into the unconscious processing level, you have crossed a threshold that most English learners never cross. The language has become part of you, not just a skill you perform. Now here is something important about this state that I want you to understand, because it prevents a very common mistake. When you reach this level of English fluency, you do not lose your native language. You do not lose your cultural identity. You do not become a different person. What you gain is access, the ability to be fully yourself in two languages rather than fully yourself in one and reduced in the other. Many learners resist the deep investment in English fluency because they feel, at some subconscious level, that becoming fluent in English means abandoning something, their identity, their culture, their sense of self. This fear is completely understandable, but it is also completely unfounded. Language and identity are deeply connected, And that connection makes the deepening of your English feel threatening to who you are. But here is the truth that every genuinely bilingual person knows: you do not have one self that speaks only one language. You have a self that is capable of full expression in multiple languages. And each language you fully inhabit gives you a new dimension of that self, new relationships, new communities, new ideas, new possibilities that were simply unavailable before. Your English-speaking self is not a replacement for your native language self. It is an expansion, an extension, a new room in the house of who you are. And when the translation mode is broken, when the two selves are no longer separated by the exhausting friction of translation, you can move between them fluidly. You can be fully yourself in both languages. And that freedom is one of the most significant things a human being can experience. Let me talk about the practical impact of this fluency on your life, because I want this to be concrete. When you think in English, when English becomes your automatic operational language in English contexts, the professional impact is enormous. You can participate in international meetings at full capacity. You can write emails that express your actual intelligence and nuance, not a reduced version of it. You can give presentations with the full force of your personality. You can negotiate, persuade, explain, and connect with people from anywhere in the world without the weight of translation making you slower, stiffer, and less confident than you actually are. In many professions and industries today, the gap between a person who can communicate fluently in English and one who cannot is a career-defining gap. Not because English makes you smarter or more competent, but because it makes your intelligence and competence visible to a global audience that speaks English. If your ideas are trapped behind the translation wall, the world does not see them. When you break that wall down, the world does. The academic impact is equally significant. English is the dominant language of global academic publishing, of research, of international conferences. A researcher who can think and write fluently in English has access to the full body of their field's knowledge, not a translated, summarized version of it. They can contribute to that body of knowledge directly, engage with colleagues from around the world, and have their work seen and cited globally. And the personal impact, the one that I think matters most, even though it is hardest to measure, is the recovery of your full self in English communication. Right now, in English conversations, you are probably a smaller version of yourself. Quieter. More cautious. Expressing less complex ideas. Telling fewer stories. Making fewer jokes. Sharing less of your opinion. Not because you have nothing to say, but because the translation machine is standing between you and the saying of it, and the cost of going through the machine is too high for everything you actually want to express. When the machine is gone, when the translation step is eliminated, you get to bring your whole self into English. Your humor. Your depth. Your opinions. Your personality. Your stories. All of it, directly, without the filter of translation flattening and reducing it. And that moment, the moment when you realize that you are being your full self in English, that you are present and alive and funny and deep and real in this language the same way you are in your own language, that moment is worth every hour of practice. Every uncomfortable impromptu speaking session. Every frustrating conversation where you could not find the words fast enough. Every morning you started narrating your thoughts in English when your brain wanted to default to your native tongue. It is worth all of it. Now let me close this chapter in this video with something that I think is essential, a perspective on the journey itself that will make the difference between people who complete this rewiring and people who give up somewhere in the middle. The journey from translation-mediated English to direct access English fluency is not a straight line. It is not a smooth upward curve. It is a messy, non-linear, sometimes discouraging process that includes genuine breakthroughs and genuine plateaus. Weeks where you feel like you are flying and weeks where you feel like you have gone backward. The plateaus are not a sign that the process has stopped. They are a sign that the brain is consolidating, integrating everything it has learned before opening up to the next phase of growth. Think of them not as stalls but as charging periods. The growth is happening below the surface. The most dangerous moment in the journey is the plateau. Because the plateau feels like failure. And when it feels like failure, the temptation to quit is highest. And this is exactly when most learners give up. Do not give up at the plateau. Adjust your practice. Add novelty. Change your input sources. Try a new output challenge. Push yourself into an uncomfortable territory. Do something in English that you have never done before. And keep going. Because on the other side of every plateau is a breakthrough. And every breakthrough brings you closer to the version of yourself that I have been describing in this chapter, the version who is fully alive in English, who communicates without a wall, who carries your full intelligence, personality, and humanity into every English interaction. That version of you already exists. It is not a fantasy. It is not reserved for people with special talent or people who grew up in English-speaking countries or people who are younger than you. It is you, on the other side of the practice. Go get it. You have just spent 2 hours with me going through one of the most important transformations a person can make in their relationship with English. You went from a surface-level understanding of what it means to be stuck in translation mode, that frustrating, exhausting, personality-dimming habit that so many learners live with for years without understanding, to a deep, honest, neurologically grounded picture of what is actually going on and exactly what to do about it. Let me quickly recap what we covered. In Chapter 1, we explored the translation trap, how it forms, and why it is the real enemy of fluency rather than vocabulary or grammar. In Chapter 2, we tore apart the wrong definitions of fluency that keep learners stuck and gave you the accurate definition that actually guides effective practice. In Chapter 3, we went inside the freezing moment, understanding cognitive overload, syntactic commitment anxiety, and self-monitoring as the 3 engines of mid-sentence collapse. In Chapter 4, we traced the mother tongue habit back to its origins in first language acquisition, and derived the 4 core principles of genuine fluency from those origins. In Chapter 5, we introduced the mental switch, the practice of shifting your inner voice into English, and gave you 3 concrete techniques to build it daily. In Chapter 6, we confronted the preparation habit and replaced it with the spontaneity skill through impromptu drills, fast response practice, and the improv mindset. In Chapter 7, we reframed vocabulary from something you know to something you own, automatic, productive, chunked, and contextually rich. In Chapter 8, we resolved the grammar paradox by separating declarative knowledge from procedural knowledge, and giving you a practical path to grammar that lives in instinct rather than rules. In Chapter 9, we gave you the complete daily rewiring practice, 90 minutes across 5 blocks, with every principle encoded in every activity. And in Chapter 10, we looked at the destination, the click, the flow, the full self in English experience that makes everything worth it. Now, before you close this video, I want you to go to the comments section and answer the question I asked at the beginning. The question was, if translation is the problem, what is the alternative? And can your brain actually learn to stop translating after years of doing it? You know the answer now. Go write it in the comments. And as you write it in English, as you compose those sentences directly, without translating, drawing on what you have understood and felt and absorbed in these 2 hours, notice what that feels like. Notice that the answer is already starting. That is the beginning of the reset. If this video gave you something, if it shifted something in how you see your English, if it gave you clarity or direction or hope, please share it with one person who needs it. Another learner who is stuck, who is frustrated, who has been told or has told themselves that they are just not good at English. Send them this video. Because the most generous thing you can do for someone in the translation trap is show them the door. Subscribe to the Speaking Reset if you are not already subscribed. Everything on this channel is built for people who are serious about this work. Not tricks. Not hacks. Not 30 days to fluency promises. Real, deep, honest work on the way your brain relates to English. And if you are serious about that work, this is where you belong. I will see you in the next video. And until then, keep the English channel on.